Turn on the news any given day and you will hear the same entrenched narrative about the Middle East. We are endlessly told that this is a region hopelessly stuck in the past, a place where people kill each other over millennia old religious hatred and ancient tribal conflicts. Historians, politicians, and journalists often present this instability as some kind of geographical inevitability, as if the very land itself is cursed with perpetual war. But they are wrong, and this mistake is fundamental. What we see today in the Middle East is not the echo of ancient wars, nor is it the inevitable consequence of religious dogma. It is the direct result of cold, calculated decisions made just a century ago. The true origin of the modern Middle East lies not in ancient texts, but in European debts, secret agreements, the thirst for control over oil, and artificial lines on a map drawn by men who had never even set foot on those sands. Today, we will break down how Europe deliberately engineered the modern Middle East in such a way that it could never find peace. Our story begins not with gunshots, but with bankruptcy. Toward the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the Middle East for over 4 centuries, earned the humiliating moniker in the European press as the sick man of Europe. Traditional history textbooks focus on its military decline, territorial losses in the Balkans, and inability to compete with industrial power, but they overlook the West's ultimate weapon, which destroyed the empire from within: financial debt. The Ottoman sultans, in an attempt to modernize their army and infrastructure, took out massive loans from European banks at extortionate interest rates. By 1881, the empire found itself unable to service its debt. In response, the Western powers did not declare war. They did something far more effective. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established. This was not merely a financial commission, it was a government within a government. British and French creditors gained direct control over tax collection, customs duties, and entire state monopolies of the empire, including the salt and tobacco trades. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse overnight. It was bought, sold off in pieces, and stripped of its economic sovereignty long before the first shots of World War I were ever fired. The local population was left in a situation where the fruits of their labor went directly to London and Paris to pay off debts they had never incurred. But why was Europe so desperately clinging to these seemingly dry and barren lands? The answer to that question changed the course of human history, and it lies in a decision made by a single man. In 1912, Winston Churchill, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, made a fateful and highly risky decision: to transition the entire British naval fleet from traditional Welsh coal to oil. Coal offered independence as it was mined within Britain itself, but oil gave ships greater speed, maneuverability, and autonomy. The only problem was that Britain had no oil of its own. Churchill declared that mastery of the seas now depended on access to this new black gold. Shortly thereafter, the British government secretly acquired a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Overnight, the Middle East ceased to be merely an exotic periphery of a crumbling empire or a trade route to India. It became the most strategically vital region on the planet. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil controlled the future of the global economy and military power. It was this thirst for black gold that became the true catalyst for all subsequent events. When World War I broke out and the Ottoman Empire entered it on the side of Germany, the British Empire saw the perfect opportunity to seize the region permanently. However, the British knew they could not defeat the Ottomans solely with their own forces in this vast and complex theater of war. They needed an uprising from within. Thus began one of the most cynical chapters in the history of diplomacy, an era that can be called the Age of Triple Deception. The British Crown, through its High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into a secret correspondence with Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca and custodian of the Islamic holy sites. Between 1915 and 1916, the British made a clear, unequivocal promise to the Arabs. If the Arab tribes rose up in rebellion against Ottoman rule, Great Britain would support the creation of a single, independent Arab state, stretching from Syria to Yemen. Trusting the British word, backed by gold and weapons, the Arabs launched the famous Great Arab Revolt. With the support of figures like T.E. Lawrence, famously known as Lawrence of Arabia, they fought a grueling guerrilla war, blowing up trains, destroying Ottoman garrisons, and shedding their blood for the dream of independence. They did not know they had been betrayed before they even won their first victory. At the very moment the Arabs were dying in the desert, believing in British promises. Something entirely different was happening in the smoke-filled offices of London and Paris. In the winter of 1916, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot leaned over a map of the Middle East. They held rulers and pencils in their hands, paying absolutely no attention to the ethnic, religious, cultural, or historical realities of the region. They simply carved up the map with straight lines. This was the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. They divided lands that had not yet been conquered into zones of direct and indirect control. Syria and Lebanon went to France. Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine went to Great Britain. It was a classic colonial division of spoils. The lines were drawn straight through deserts, splitting ancient tribes, tearing apart trade routes, and artificially forcing rival groups together. Mark Sykes literally drew a line from the letter E in acre to the last K in Kirkuk. To these diplomats, the Middle East was a blank canvas, and the people living there were mere statistics to be disregarded for the sake of imperial geopolitical interests. But the deception did not end with two parties. In 1917, seeking to secure the support of influential Zionist circles in Europe and the UEs, as well as to establish a strategic buffer next to the Suez Canal, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. In this brief document, Great Britain promised support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Thus, by the end of World War I, the exact same territory had been promised 3 times. To the Arabs as an independent state, to the French and British as colonial possessions, and to the Zionist movement as a national home. It was a ticking time bomb planted in the very foundation of the future Middle East. The British were giving away land they did not own to people whose interests they had no intention of protecting, all to achieve their own short-term military objectives. When the war ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the time came for peace conferences. Arab leaders arrived in Paris expecting to receive their promised independence. Instead, they faced the cold reality of a new world order. At the San Remo Conference in 1920, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was legalized under a new facade. The League of Nations, supposedly created to ensure peace and the right of nations to self-determination, introduced the Mandate system. The Mandate was a hypocritical legal term implying that the Arab peoples were supposedly not yet ready for self-governance, and therefore Great Britain and France needed to tutor them until they matured enough for independence. In practice, it was the exact same colonial occupation, just under a different name. French troops brutally crushed the Arab government in Damascus when it attempted to declare independence, while the British used air power and poison gas to suppress uprisings in Iraq. This is where the most crucial part of the story begins, the creation of artificial states. Let's look at Iraq. The British created this state simply by merging 3 completely distinct Ottoman provinces: Basra in the south, Baghdad in the center, and Mosul in the north. Basra was predominantly inhabited by Shia Arabs, closely tied to neighboring Persia. Baghdad was the center for Sunni Arab, and Mosul, added at the last minute after colossal oil reserves were discovered there, was inhabited mostly by Kurds, who had their own distinct culture and language, and who had also been promised an independent state but were deceived. The British stitched these 3 vastly different groups together, placing a foreign king from another country at the helm of the state, propped up by British bayonets. From day one, Iraq was doomed to internal conflict. The Sunni minority, backed by the British, ruled over the Shia majority and the Kurdish population. Constant tension, rebellions, and repression became the only way to keep this artificial construct from falling apart. What is often called a centuries-old feud between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq today is in many ways a direct consequence of how the British engineered the state for the convenience of extracting oil. The French in Syria acted even more insidiously, employing the classic Roman tactic of divide and conquer. Realizing that Arab nationalism, centered in Sunni Damascus, posed a threat to them, the French decided to fragment the country. They carved out Lebanon, creating an artificial Christian majority there to secure a reliable ally on the coast. Syria itself was divided into several small states along ethno-confessional lines. A state for the Alawites on the coast, a state for the Druze in the south, and separate administrations for Damascus and Aleppo. The French deliberately recruited minorities, especially Alawites, into their colonial armed forces to suppress the Sunni majority. When France eventually left, these armed minorities found themselves in power. This is exactly why the Assad dynasty, belonging to the Alawite minority, was able to seize and hold power in Syria for decades, ruling with an iron fist to avoid being annihilated by the majority. Sectarian violence in Syria is not an ancient curse. It is the legacy of French colonial engineering. No less tragic was the fate of the territories under British control on the west bank of the Jordan River. The British Mandate in Palestine became the arena for an intractable conflict, seeded by the Balfour Declaration. The British tried to balance between growing Jewish immigration and the outrage of the indigenous Arab population, whose lands were being bought up and rights ignored. London constantly shifted its policies, sometimes restricting immigration, sometimes encouraging it, depending on what was politically expedient at the moment. When the situation finally spiraled completely out of control after World War II, the British simply washed their hands of it and left the region, abandoning Jews and Arabs to a bloody war over territory whose borders were never justly defined. This conflict, which continues to this day and claims thousands of lives, is a direct product of irresponsible British diplomacy that handed out impossible and contradictory promises. It is crucial to understand that the borders in the Middle East were not drawn to create viable, prosperous nation-states. They were drawn to ensure that these states remained weak and dependent. The artificial borders sliced through traditional economic zones. Nomads could no longer freely move their herds. Merchants found themselves cut off from their traditional markets by new customs barriers. This economic fragmentation made the new states completely dependent on Western markets and Western loans. Moreover, these artificial states suffered from an acute deficit of legitimacy. Governments imposed from the outside had no support within society. To maintain power in countries where the population had been artificially glued together from rival groups, these regimes had only one path left: the path of brutal dictatorship and militarization. Historians often blame Islam or Arab culture for the lack of democracy in the Middle East. They speak of an incompatibility between their traditions and Western values, but this is a deeply flawed and arrogant view. The truth is that democracy could not emerge in states whose borders were drawn with the sole purpose of ensuring division and weakness. Any attempt at democratic elections in a state like Mandate-era Iraq or Syria would inevitably lead to the majority voting along sectarian lines, which would threaten minorities who would in turn seek help from the military or outside forces. Authoritarianism in the Middle East is not a cultural quirk. It is a structural necessity to keep artificially created state entities alive, which, without the application of brute force, would immediately shatter apart along the very lines drawn by Sykes and Picot. By the mid-20th century, as the European empires began to wane, new powers entered the arena: the United States and the Soviet Union. But they did not fix the mistakes of the past. They merely exploited the already broken architecture of the Middle East for their own interests during the Cold War. Oil became an even more critical factor. Regime changes, propping up brutal dictators in exchange for loyalty and resource access, arming opposing sides. All of this continued the logic of the colonial era. Western powers continued to intervene, overthrowing democratically elected governments, as was the case with Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, when he attempted to nationalize the British oil company. This interference only fueled anti-Western sentiment and radicalism. Islamic fundamentalism, which is often presented today as the primary cause of all the Middle East's woes, is actually, in many respects, a reaction, a desperate and radical response to decades of humiliation, foreign intervention, the failures of secular nationalist regimes, and the sheer artificiality of the region's state structure. We must stop looking at the Middle East through the prism of myths about ancient, irrational hatred. The peoples of this region lived together for centuries under the Ottoman Empire. Yes, it was no utopia, it had its conflicts and tensions, but it was a system that functioned and provided a degree of stability based on the recognition of differences and local self-governance. The current chaos is a product of modernization, implemented in the most brutal and cynical way imaginable. It is the result of Western powers treating the region not as a place inhabited by people with their own rights and aspirations, but as a giant gas station that needed to be partitioned, fenced off with barbed wire, and guarded by mercenary overseers. Understanding this true history does not justify the violence or crimes committed by modern regimes or terrorist groups, but it is essential if we are to stop blaming the victims of historical injustice for their own tragedy. The Middle East is sick, but its illness is not some ancient virus of tribal hatred. These are deep, unhealing scars left by the scalpel of colonialism, the greed of international bankers, the obsession with oil, and the arrogance of European diplomats who thought they could rewrite the destinies of millions with a single stroke of a pen on a map. Until we acknowledge this truth, as long as historians and politicians continue to cling to comfortable myths that absolve the West of responsibility, we will never understand the Middle East. And, more importantly, we will never be able to help it find a path to genuine peace. A peace that must be built not on artificial lines drawn a century ago, but on justice, respect, and the authentic right of peoples to self-determination. A right that was stolen from them in those very smoke-filled rooms of London and Paris.